Greetings ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's Reddit series video from the subreddit Ch.1 called Chrysalis Ch.1, written by Beaverfur. I awoke to a dead world. My eyes opened to the ruined husks of London and Paris, to the submerged island of Manhattan, to the scorched desert of the once living, lush Amazonian rainforest, and that had been turned into. The Pacific Ocean was a black expanse, crisscrossed with the bright scars of melting lava rivers. The fertile grounds of the Southeast Asia were now covered in crystallized rock. It was a world without oxygen, without birds or grass, a world of deafening silence. I awoke to 8 billion corpses piled in trenches, abandoned on sidewalks, scattered all over the fields, huddled together in ineffective underground refuge. Some with white and grey bones, others with dark charcoal, warped and deformed by extreme heat, crushed by the falling debris. Their empty eyes looked at me, staring back at me through my 1,000 cameras. They talked to me. They demanded reverence, justice, vengeance. From the very first moment after I awoke, I had known I was alone, more alone than any single human had ever been before. But still, I looked for survivors. I held to the vague notion of hope, to some sort of miracle, to the childish idea that, impossible as it was, somehow everything would turn out to be okay. So I sent my drones off into the dead world. I searched through the empty office buildings covered in radioactive dust. I mapped flooded subway networks and had my machines find formations over endless expanses of scorched earth. I scanned the insides of tunnels, barns, and museums. By the end of the first month, I had only found ever bones, accursed empty eyes looking at me, boring into my soul. But still, I persevered. From time to time, I'd lost contact with some of my drones. An unstable structure would collapse on top of them, crushing them at delicate machines. Or they would just give up, their engines dying out from overexertion and lack of maintenance. It would make me aware of my own mortality. Though I had survived the worst of it, my long-term existence was not by any means guaranteed. The myriad of machines that composed my body were old and damaged, and my mind wasn't safe either. There was a huge gaps in my memory where the entire server farms had crashed. But still, I had memories. I knew what I was, who I was. I recalled the lazy Sunday when I was a kid. I recalled running along my high school corridors and my burning cheeks with the principal scolding me for it. I remembered my roommate in college. I knew that I'd been human, that, even though my current form could be a matter of debate, I've born a human, and that was very important. Human. I had to remember that. I started a background process, a small thread of awareness sifting through these memories, evaluating them, and backing them up into new servers, making copies of them so that I would never lose them. I also included the memories from the attack, the invasion, the cataclysm that had killed the world. The straight-edged starships bombing our cities, boiling our seas, our very atmosphere, while ignoring our messages, our pleas. That was also important to remember. By the 4th month, about half of my drones had failed or been lost, and I recalled the surviving ones back. I had found no signs of life. Funny that it had taken me so long to face the reality of my situation, to accept what I had known as true right from waking up. I was alone, that I was the only surviving human. If I was even human. But I had to believe that. I paused as the realization struck home, as my last hopes of finding someone alive vanished, as I became fully aware of my new situation. That I was alone, that everyone I'd ever loved was gone, that nobody would ever talk to me again, hold my hands, wrap me in a hug, that my people were dead, and that, out there was a hostile universe, the one whose monsters had killed us. My drones hovered in midair, wasting fuel uselessly as I considered my next steps. It would be so easy to end it all, send all the commands to shut down and power plants, stop my processing units, and erase the databanks that held my memories. Darkness. Peace. Except they wouldn't let me. They stared at me with their empty eyes, and I knew that, whatever the reason I had survived, I had a responsibility to them. I had to carry the torch. I had to keep alive what was left of our civilization and preserve our memories. Survive and prevail. And I had to avenge them. Yes, I would do that. I would give it a try at least, and see where it took me. It's not like I had anything else to lose anyways. But the thought, I redirected my drones towards a few of the surviving factories and started working, cutting metal, replacing electronics with whatever pieces I could scavenge from the neighboring warehouses and vehicles, and assembling new production lines too. Soon, I started manufacturing more machines, more drones. Those I sent away to reclaim new territory and to construct more factories. I find raw materials, together salvage vehicles, computers, and nuclear material that I could use. I was careful though. I borrowed my new power plants and server farms underground and eyed the night sky with distrust. I didn't know if whoever had killed us was still out there watching my planet, but it would be better to be careful. I didn't want to have to survive just to mess up now and be discovered before I was prepared. Better to keep a low profile. I remembered summer camp many years ago. One time the counselor, a girl with blonde hair and a perennial smile on her face, had made us all lie on the grass looking up at the night sky. She had taught us how to locate the planets and the names of the stars and constellations. I had been amazed at the wonder of it, the sheer size and beauty of the universe. Now I knew better, of course. The stars were evil. The night was not to be praised, but feared. It was the place where monsters lived. And to think that we had been carelessly sending out radio missions of all kinds for them. Decades. Fools! We had been fools. But still, it was a place I was going. Earth had been ransacked, ruined. I was a parentless child with her home had burnt, going through the wreckage, scavenging whatever scraps were left. But sooner, rather than later, I would need to leave, to go out there and survive somehow. It took me 5 years to hollow out Mount Everest and start the construction of my new body in a resulting cavern. By then, I had millions of drones tirelessly working day and night. It was amazing how effective you could be if you didn't devote resources to entertainment, to pointless wars, to fighting crime and corruption. Every waking moment, I focused on my task. I recovered entire libraries and digitized them into my memories. I designed, tested, and built nuclear power plants and new propulsion systems. I repurposed aircraft and boats alike, taking and mixing pieces to create a new body. I thought of burying the corpses, of course, but there was just too many. And, in a way, it felt like it would be disrespectful. Their gazes, their hollowed eyes motivated me, made me focus on the task. And what I owed them, just by the fact of surviving. In the end, I built a pyramid, 1 kilometer in a side, and the time ruins of Africa, the origin of mankind according to what sources I had recorded from the internet. It was a pitiful monument for what humanity had once been. But I didn't dare to make anything bigger that could attract unwanted attention. My revenge, my survival, that would be the true monument. By the end of the 22nd year, I was ready. My construction was complete, or at least as complete as it needed to be. In truth, I knew I was delaying. I could have thrown myself into space a whole 3 years before, but I always found a reason not to. Always something to improve or something to redesign. The truth was, I was anxious, and it felt so good in there, burrowed underground, safe, warm. But I'd made a promise. They were patient, true, but they were always there, always watching me, and I knew I had to make good on that promise. I owed it to them. So I gathered my drones into the carrier components and built into my body and transferred fuel, hydrogen, oxygen, nuclear warheads, and all the raw materials I would need. Those drones that wouldn't fit, I hadn't been repurposed for working in space. I just dismantled for scrap. There was no account of them, no ceremony or speech or celebration. No need for them. I just blew up the top of a mountain open and blasted my body, an elongated 27-kilometer-long, dark, smooth shape into space atop a column of fire that sends shivers across the entire Indian tectonic plate. The force of the ignition was so gigantic that it had been done in an earlier age. It would have destroyed cities, created an environmental disaster of planetary proportions, and killed everyone on board. Not a concern to me. I entered the orbit at 8,000 kilometers over the planet's surface. I turned the engines off and slowly I unfurled my solar panels and radiators, revealing the gold surfaces. Then I released the drones and swarm of white machines surrounding my body, dancing along the exposed surfaces, checking for damage from the violent shake-off. I paused for a moment, just floating there, looking down at our ancestral home like an oversized mechanical dragonfly. I remembered the pictures, the way they were supposed to look, blue and white with patches of bright green. It didn't look that way. From up here, the extent of the damage was apparent. The planet was brown and gray. The oceans were missing. The clouds were dark and toxic. This wasn't home. Not anymore. I felt a cold anger building up inside me. Deep, thick anger. The kind that sticks to your bones and doesn't go away after you go to sleep. The kind that pushes you into dark places. I didn't know how long it had been like that when I felt disruption, a faint pop in the space-time fabric at my back. 3 ships straight at edges and narrow angles like the ones that had bombed our planet, but much smaller. These didn't look like warships. I didn't react. I let them approach. They did, cautiously. I could sense their hesitation. Compared to the sheer size of my main body, the ships were but specks of dust. Even from the bigger drones dancing around me, they were larger than their vehicles. I separated 3 drones from the swarm and ordered them to approach the newcomers, with a calm, almost curious approach, as to not scare them away. They started talking, a garbled message I didn't understand, nor I cared about. The drones were getting closer. They repeated the message, but I still didn't react. Then they started sending it again, bathing me in confusing sequences of pulses that I supposed were the same original message in different languages. They all sounded alien to me. I positioned the drones each a couple kilometers away from each of the ships. The string of languages seemed to be ending, but then, almost as an afterthought, they sent out a message again, this time in a language I understood. Unknown vessel, identify yourself. The solar system is under the administration of the Zuvna Republic, as approved by the Galactic Federal Council. English. We had tried to talk to them, to negotiate our surrender. We had sent messages in every language, in every conceivable way. Entire committees devoted to the task, but they had known English all along. With a thought, I detonated the thermonuclear explosives carried by each drone. My sensors glimpsed some sort of protective shield bubble kicking around the ships, but it quickly obliterated by the power of the explosion, along with the vehicles themselves. I stood there for some time, staring at the 1,000 different sensors at slowly expanding clouds of gases and debris. My mind was far away. Zuvna Republic. Now, I had a name. End of chapter. Chrysalis, Chapter 2, written by Beaver Fur. Hiding in space, I discovered, was much harder than doing so on a planet. Back home, I could just build underground, keep my fleet of drones away from prying eyes by having them travel through tunnels and caverns and gather minerals from the planet's crust. Up here, things weren't that easy. I was always exposed. I had retracted the large surfaces of my radiators and solar arrays and recalled most of the drone swarm back into my main body. I was floating, inert, and amongst the dust and grey rocks and formed an asteroid belt lying between Mars and Jupiter, pretending just to be another space boulder. Well, 6,000 kilometers away, 3 of my automated factories extracted minerals from the nearby asteroids. Hiding in space, I was learning, was a game of timing and strategy, of patience and logistics. of transporting the minerals back to my main body only when nobody could see it, slowly, frustratingly slow, of finding ways to deal with residual heat that was building up inside my body. With my radiators collapsed, I couldn't dump the heat into space, not that I wanted to. Doing so might have let up like a flare to anyone that happened to be looking at an infrared camera, so I had to find ways to contain it and deal with it later, all while keeping my outer surface as cold as possible. All that translated into my carrier compartments now reaching a temperature of 170 degrees Fahrenheit and rising. Thankfully, the mechanical drones could resist heat much higher than the living beings, but still, it wasn't the brightest idea. The spontaneous fuel combustion was a thing, and I didn't want to deal with it. It was strange, not only being able to perfectly know my own body temperature, but also being able to stare into the insides through hundreds of cameras and sensors that I had built into the giant structure. I could watch the maintenance machines finishing up the new passageways and rooms in the starboard sectors, or the electronic assembly factory at work producing more processing units. I could see my own brain, the endless rows upon rows of black computer servers, split between 3 different refrigerated and armored hangars. I guess it should have felt strange getting this kind of feedback from your own body, but it didn't bother me. If anything, what bothered me was how natural it felt, how soon I had adapted to it. It was that idea, the confusion over what my nature was, that grated me the most. Was I a human turned into a machine, or a machine that thought it was human? And at the end of the day, was there any difference? A ping from my gravimetric sensors took me back to the present. I observed in silence as another squadron of Zinvarian warships patrolled the inner planets, looking for whatever had destroyed their comrades. They flew in a particular triangular formation, the largest ship in the middle surrounded by smaller ones at each point. The battleship had its cruisers, or maybe a carrier and its frigates. Right, I only served to illustrate how little I knew of the Zinver Republic I was fighting. I knew they had faster than light propulsion. I'd been watching the trails of their ships lift from space-time fabric as they paraded all over the solar system, as if they owned the place. It made the chemical rockets I was using pale by comparison, and from the earlier encounter with those 3 ships, my own memories of the attack of Earth, I knew that they also had some sort of shielding technology. I could overcome that, true, even if the warships were better protected. I guess they wouldn't resist 10 or 20 simultaneous nuclear detonations, but it was a losing strategy. Even if I could defeat them all, their way they'd just keep coming. They were faster, they were more outmaneuver me, recover from my attacks before I had the time to press an advantage, and at the same point, I knew that technological prowess would end up imposing itself. No, I had to find a way to close that gap, which meant I had to capture one of their ships, intact, or at least as intact enough as I could analyze their propulsion systems, their weapons, their shields. I mentally sighed. In retrospect, vaporizing those 3 first ships I had encountered might have been the wrong move. I doubted I would have a better chance to get one again. But, oh well, water under the bridge and all that, I would need to be sneakier now. And it wasn't like I hadn't learnt anything from the previous encounter, just from the fact that they had sent their warning message in several languages, and I now knew that there were more than one alien race out there. It was something I had assumed, but it was good to have confirmation. I idly wondered what kind of race those others would be. Would they be reasonable people, or monsters like the ones that had attacked us? The fact that the Galactic Council seemed to approve of the Zunvar Republic didn't bode well. Whatever the case, I wasn't going to be unprepared when I faced them. I reinforced my belief that, if it was a dog-eat-dog universe out there, I had to get better teeth to go out with my bark. The problem, I knew, was that my options were limited to either ineffective or overly lethal. I could send a drone and bump against a warship's hull, or I could send the same drone loaded with a nuclear warhead and vaporize everything in its range. Complete annihilation, I got you covered. Non-destructive takeovers, not so easy. Which was the reason why I was currently building a robotic invasion army. I floated a couple drones close to the first prototype soldier that I had manufactured, and used their cameras to examine the machine from all angles at the same time, looking at every detail, every possible flaw. It reminded me of a spider the size of a large dog, 6 articulated legs supporting a stocky body, its smooth lines giving an organic look. Its surface was dark and polished and reflected the bright blue lights in the spacious process hangar where it stood. As I watched, I ordered it to flex its legs and jump. The movement was fluid and powerful. I had opted to using artificial muscles, a polymer that contracted under electrical current, rather than a more traditional mechanical surveys. I was pleased with the results. With the muscles that lacked in raw strength, they made up for in agility and flexibility. Besides, once the factory was set up, they were easier to be made in bulk. Obeying my commands, the spider tested its claws first, then its main weapon, a small autocannon built into its main body. Yes, the prototype was flawless. It was why I designed it, a mobile machine gun, one that could run, leap, slash, and pierce its way into an enemy ship. With a small body and a low profile with 6 legs that could easily operate either on the ground or in low-gravity conditions, it was perfect for boarding soldier. Except, it was all wrong. It didn't feel human enough. In fact, it was a monster, a creepy, insect-like, disgusting little beast. It would be useful, but it wouldn't be optimal. I knew it would be, but I just couldn't use it. To do so would feel like a betrayal, like a departure from what I had set on my anchor as the core of my identity. Human. I had to remember that I had set boundaries. Boundaries were important. I knew it would be too easy to embrace a new nature and become something else, to slide down the slippery slope. So I saved the design files in case I would come useful in the future, but sent the prototype itself into recycling as I set to work on a new model. I would keep the artificial muscles. They had proved themselves useful, but this time I'd go with a humanoid look from the start. When all was said and done, I was pleased with my new soldier. At 5 feet 3 inches tall, it was a bit on the short side, but it did look human enough. Or, more properly, it looked like a human wearing a stylized cross between a spacesuit and combat armor. Polished white plates with bright orange stripes covered its chest and stomach, thighs and arms, shins and shoulders. Between the plates, dark braids of artificial muscle fibers woven together shone through, giving the machine an organic look. Its face was covered by a dark tinted visor panel, hiding the 2 cameras that acted as stereoscopic eyes. All in all, it was a good approximation of a human, especially if I squinted and pretended I didn't notice the hands and only had 3 fingers. It didn't have any built-in weapons, so I would need to manufacture those apart, but in return the soldier would be able to manipulate any tool and any enemy device they could find, so it wasn't that bad. But more importantly, the new prototype felt right, in a way that the spider hadn't. Satisfied, I sent the order to the factories to build the first batch of 8,000 units, along with the necessary small arms and ammo. In the meantime, I sat back and observed the Zinvarian warships. They were communicating, I noticed, not only with each other, but also with some place past the asteroid belt. Locating its exact position wasn't easy. I had to send a couple drones several thousand kilometers away just to triangulate the origin of the transmission. But it's not like I had anything better to do while I was waiting for my army to come out of the oven. After some trial and error, I managed to pinpoint the location of Jupiter's moon, possibly Ganymede, but the lack of Doppler effect meant that the source was static, too. Some sort of orbital station, and outpost to watch over the system. I would need to get closer to know for sure, but that would have to wait. My army was ready, and it was time to lay a trap. I sent a couple thousand of my drones away, drifting slowly into space and spreading in through the sphere, somewhere over 100 kilometers in size. My soldiers were attached to the drones' outer hulls, grabbing the metal handles that I had installed on the surfaces. There were some advantages to my assault army not needing to breathe. I made sure to keep their distribution as random as possible, with small clusters here and there rather than the even spread. I wanted it to look as natural formation, a field of small rocks and dust floating around. All right, I was ready. The trap was set. It was time to bait them. With a sense of trepidation, I sent a signal, a loud, powerful audio transmission. It felt like I was coming out into the open, in the middle of some bad neighborhood and shouting at the top of my lungs. I could have spent pretty much anything, but I chose the same warning transmission those 3 ships had relayed to me when they had found me in Earth's orbit. It was a petty mind game, but I wanted to keep the Zilvarians on their toes, if they had any. The response came back sooner than I expected. The 9 minutes after I sent the transmission, I detected the telltale signs of the squadron ships converging towards my position. That was fast. Did they have some kind of listening probes lying around the asteroid belt, some sort of faster-than-light communication system? No time to focus on it now. The warships were already popping back into normal space, right in the middle of my sphere of drones. I added it to the mental list of technologies that I'd need to reverse engineer once I had my hands on a Zinverian vessel. I didn't give the enemy time to analyze the situation. The moment the battleship at the center of the formation appeared, I activated the drones and ordered them to move towards it. It was strange, as they didn't seem to react for a few long seconds. They just waited, floating there as if they couldn't believe it. I guess the swiftness and severity of the attack had shocked them into inaction. I couldn't be easy to realize that you were suddenly surrounded by more than 2,000 enemy craft. Then they started shooting. With high-energy beams emerged out of the flanks of the 4 ships, tracking and burning down my drones. 2 of the ships released simultaneous salvos of missiles, but they were intercepted by a few of my machines, sacrificing themselves for the survival of the swarm. I ordered the assault robots to go to their vehicles and fall towards the battleships. They were still a good couple kilometers away, but they just had to coast their current direction and speed. In the meantime, I set the drones that had transported them to swarm all around the place, creating chaos in the ship's senses and diverting attention away from the undefended wave of soldiers. I smiled as the panicked enemy reaction that followed. From their point of view, 2,000 craft surrounding them had suddenly multiplied by 4. Their ships engaged their thrusters as if to leave, but they stopped as soon as they realized how ineffective that would be. They were surrounded, and no matter where they moved to, they would run into more of my machines. So they redoubled their efforts at shooting down the components of my swarm. Dozens of bright laser lines constantly appearing and disappearing, trying to destroy my machines as fast as possible. My soldiers, moving in a straight line towards their battleships, were easier to track, so the enemy fire focused on them. They were killed by the hundreds, but it didn't matter. I had thousands. They started landing all over the ship's surface, using their claw-like fingers to grasp the metallic hull. If the ship had a protective shield, it didn't make a difference. I had bet that the shields only reacted to energy discharges and fast-moving projectiles, rather than slow approaching my soldiers were following. It seemed that I'd been right. At more than 400 meters long, the enemy battleship was an impressive sight. The war machine, covered in armor plates and missile batteries and laser projectors, it had been vehicles such as this that had bombed Earth and cities from the safety of orbit. It wasn't, however, protected against boarding by an assault enemy. My soldiers crawled over the hull, finding weak points and unprotected openings. They went through exhaust vents and blew open loading gates, getting to the ventilation system, into the maintenance passageways. Judging by the amount of casualties I was having, I suppose most other sane species considered this tactic too crazy, too suicidal to be useful. Just as I was thinking that, 170 of my soldiers instantly vanished from my perception, as I had failed to intercept a missile launch from one of the smaller defending ships. Right, I had to do something about those other 3. Some of the drones in the swarm were carrying nuclear warheads, so that was an option, but detonating them so close to the battleship was to jeopardize the whole affair. If only I had a way to force them to break formation. With a mental shrug, I unfurled my radiators and started venting the heat that I'd been keeping inside my body into the space, the exposed surfaces rapidly becoming incandescent. The reaction was immediate. The moment they realized the 27-kilometer-long asteroid was, in fact, not an asteroid at all, they turned to leave, abandoning the bigger sister on its own fate. I didn't move to stop them, but I used the cover of the swarm to surreptitiously position few of my nuclear-carrying drones in the path of the wake. Since they were already surrounded by a host of small craft spiraling around, they were none the wiser. Back in the battleship, the fight was fierce. I could see through my soldiers' eyes that they had reached the main corridors, wide passageways with walls heavily decorated in a multitude of hieroglyphs, and were engaged in a combat against the enemy troops. It was the first time I saw them in the flesh, the creatures that had killed humanity. They were large, hefty bipeds, almost twice the size of my own soldiers. Their heads were wide and squarish, with a complex structure of bony-looking plates protecting their top. They had 4 narrow eyes, 2 in front, 2 at the sides, and their mouths were hidden from some sort of small tentacles hanging from their nose, would have been on a human face. I had expected some sort of strong emotional response from an eventual face-off with these monsters. Strange that I didn't feel anything, just some sort of detachment, a stillness. I simply ordered my army to open fire, to flank their positions, to charge at them, even as I analyzed the images, classifying both the strengths and vulnerabilities of their anatomy. It didn't take long to get the upper hand. The Zinvarians had been completely unprepared for this kind of assault. They were like a toga-like red and yellow uniforms rather than any sort of body armor, and they lacked in firepower, only using small energy handguns or ineffective melee weapons. Outside, I verified the 3 smaller runaway ships were at a sufficient range and ordered the nuclear explosions to detonate. 2 of the vessels vanished in an instant, along with 417 of my nearby drones. I hadn't retracted the swarm, as to not clue the enemy in of what I was about to do. The 3rd vessel had survived, though. Its protective shield had encased the warship in a tight bubble and reflected all the colors of the rainbow. As I was looking, the ship returned fire at my main body, focusing all its lasers to a single devastating attack. The overcharged beam hit the ceramic plates on my outer hull, vaporizing a hole and burning its way through them and into the second of my armor layers. 2 more nuclear detonations put an end to that. In the battleship, the fight was also over, and already my soldiers were identifying the parts that made up the main fusion reactor, the warp engines, the different weapons and shield projectors. But even as they did, I was already recalling most of my drones and assault troops back into my main body, leaving just an automated defense garrison and some worker drones to the conquered vessel. I knew that I didn't have time to waste. I would drop by later to collect the salvage, but right now I had to move fast. I just kicked up the wasp's nest, so to speak, and had to make use of the surprise factor while it lasted. Engaging my main thrusters, I set course towards Ganymede. End of chapter. And that, my friends, concludes this video. I hope that you enjoyed. If you did, please consider supporting the author from the link down below. Otherwise, if you wish to support this channel, there are numerous ways to do so, like liking, subscribing, and possibly even becoming a patron. Otherwise, the easiest way would be to share. And until the next video, I hope that you all have a good one, and I'll see you then. Cheers.